There is a sentence so small, yet so poisonous, that when someone says it to you, it reveals more than anger. It reveals intent, not frustration, not misunderstanding. Intent, because hatred rarely announces itself with screaming. It hides in calm voices. It disguises itself as logic. It even pretends to be honesty. And when a person looks at you after hurting you, after betraying you, humiliating you, undermining you, and says the exact phrase, "You're too sensitive," what they are really saying is far darker. They are saying, "I did it on purpose, and I don't regret it." Tonight, we will break this down carefully, not to make you paranoid, not to make you bitter, but to make you aware, because awareness is protection, and protection is power. Let us explore the 5 hidden truths behind this phrase and why it often reveals intentional damage. When someone says, "You're too sensitive," something subtle but profound has just occurred beneath the surface of the conversation. The atmosphere shifts. The emotional gravity in the room changes direction. What was once about their behavior is now about your reaction. The spotlight moves off their action and lands squarely on your character. And if you are not deeply aware, you will accept that shift without realizing you have just surrendered your ground. This is not a simple misunderstanding. It is a psychological maneuver. The issue is no longer what they said in the meeting, how they humiliated you in front of others, or how their words cut deeper than they pretend. The issue becomes your response, your tone, your fragility. Instead of accountability, they offer accusation. Instead of apology, they offer diagnosis. They speak as though they are observing a flaw in you, rather than acknowledging harm they caused. Imagine the scene clearly. You present an idea at work. You have thought about it carefully. It matters to you. In front of everyone, a colleague laughs and dismisses it with a sarcastic remark. The room follows their lead. You feel heat rise in your chest. Later, you gather courage and approach them privately. You explain that it felt disrespectful. They lean back, amused, and say, "You're too sensitive. It was just a joke." In that moment, the humiliation you felt becomes invisible. The embarrassment you carried home is erased from the narrative. Now you are the problem. Now your nervous system, which reacted naturally to social rejection, is framed as defective, and something dangerous begins to happen inside you. You begin to doubt yourself. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe I'm misunderstood. Maybe I need thicker skin. This inner dialogue is not weakness. It is the mind trying to reconcile 2 realities, the pain you felt and the denial you received. Research on emotional manipulation has shown that repeated invalidation gradually erodes self-trust. When your feelings are consistently dismissed, your internal compass begins to spin. You stop asking, "Was that wrong?" and start asking, "What's wrong with me?" This is the silent violence of inversion. It turns truth upside down. The person who says, "You're too sensitive," is often protecting something fragile within themselves. To admit they were careless, cruel, or insecure would require strength. It would require them to confront the shadow aspects of their own personality, the envy, the hostility, the need for dominance. Instead, they project weakness onto you. It feels safer for them to believe you are delicate than to admit they were destructive, and so the pattern forms. They provoke, you react, they label, you question yourself. Over time, this repetition creates a psychological cage. You begin editing your emotions before expressing them. You rehearse your concerns in your head, softening them, shrinking them, trying to make them reasonable, enough to avoid being called sensitive again. You start betraying your own instincts in order to maintain peace. But consider this carefully: sensitivity is not the same as instability. Sensitivity is awareness. It is the capacity to detect subtle shifts in tone, intention, and respect. It is the nervous system's intelligence. When someone steps on your foot, pain is not weakness. It is information. And when someone steps on your dignity, emotional pain is also information. The tragedy occurs when you are convinced to ignore that information. If they can make you doubt your reality, they never have to face theirs. If you question your perception, they avoid self-examination. This is why the phrase can feel so disorienting. It is not just dismissal, it is an attempt to rewrite the story in real time. It is a quiet rewriting of history where your hurt never existed and their behavior was harmless. Over time, you may notice a pattern. The phrase appears whenever you set a boundary, whenever you point out inconsistency, whenever you refuse to laugh at something that feels degrading, and slowly, you may begin to shrink to avoid hearing it again. But there is a deeper truth waiting beneath the discomfort. The moment you recognize the inversion, you reclaim your footing. You realize that the shift of focus was not natural, it was engineered. You begin to separate your emotional signal from their narrative about it. You understand that feeling hurt does not make you flawed. It makes you human, and in that realization, something stabilizes within you. You stop scrambling to defend your sensitivity. You stop apologizing for your perception. You start observing calmly instead of absorbing blindly. The spell weakens, because once you see the reversal clearly, it no longer controls you. There is something profoundly revealing about the moment a person refuses to acknowledge your pain. Not because they did not understand it, not because they were confused, but because they chose not to care. When someone responds to your hurt with, "You're too sensitive," what is being exposed is not your fragility, it is their absence of empathy. And that absence is rarely random. Healthy individuals, even flawed ones, possess a natural corrective instinct. When they realize they have hurt someone, something inside them adjusts. If you accidentally step on someone's foot and they wince and say, "That hurt," your immediate reaction is not to evaluate the strength of their nervous system. You apologize, you shift your weight, you show concern. This response requires no advanced psychology. It is the basic reflex of empathy. But when someone repeatedly meets your pain with dismissal, something deeper is operating. They are not simply unaware, they are unwilling. An unwillingness to acknowledge harm is a powerful signal. It communicates. Without saying it directly, "Your pain does not matter to me." In intimate relationships, this becomes especially corrosive. Imagine a partner who frequently makes subtle but cutting remarks about your appearance. Perhaps they comment on your weight in front of friends. Perhaps they compare you to others in ways that feel diminishing. You finally gather the courage to say, "That hurts me." And instead of reflection, you are met with, "You're too sensitive." "I'm just being honest." Notice the inversion again. Honesty becomes the shield. Your reaction becomes the flaw. What is presented as rationality is, in reality, contempt. And contempt is not a minor emotional irritation. It is one of the most destructive forces in human connection. Psychological research on long-term relationships consistently identifies contempt as one of the strongest predictors of relational collapse. Why? Because contempt signals superiority. It says, "I stand above you. Your feelings are inconvenient. Your experience is exaggerated." Beneath the calm tone, beneath the casual delivery, there is emotional hostility. Hostility does not always scream. Sometimes it smiles. When a person cannot tolerate your vulnerability, when they feel irritated by your emotional honesty, it often reflects something unresolved within them. Empathy requires self-awareness. It requires the capacity to sit with discomfort, to admit, "I may have been wrong," or "I may have caused harm." For some personalities, this feels intolerable. It threatens their internal image of strength or superiority. So they protect that image by minimizing you. And the tragedy is not only that they dismiss your pain. The deeper tragedy is what begins to happen inside you. You start to hesitate before expressing hurt. You measure your words carefully. You downplay your feelings. You might even laugh along with the insult to prove you are not too sensitive. Each time you do this, you move slightly further away from yourself. Over time, the nervous system adapts to chronic dismissal. You may become anxious, hyper, aware of tone shifts, constantly scanning for signs of ridicule. Or you may go numb, convincing yourself that nothing really hurts anymore. But numbness is not strength. It is armor. And armor is heavy. It is important to understand that repeated lack of empathy is rarely accidental. Everyone can have a defensive moment. Everyone can react poorly once. But when the pattern persists, when your pain is consistently met with irritation rather than curiosity, you are witnessing a choice. They are choosing comfort over connection. They are choosing ego over intimacy. And this is where awareness becomes liberation. When you recognize that their dismissal reflects their limitation, not your weakness, something stabilizes within you. You begin to see that your emotional responses are not excessive, they are signals. They are your psyche's attempt to protect dignity and coherence. Sensitivity in its healthy form is attunement. It allows you to detect misalignment before it becomes destruction. The question then shifts. It is no longer, am I too sensitive? It becomes, why is this person threatened by my feelings? That shift in perspective changes everything. Instead of shrinking, you observe. Instead of apologizing for your pain, you evaluate their capacity for empathy. Relationships thrive on mutual recognition. When one person's inner world is consistently dismissed, intimacy cannot survive. It withers under the weight of superiority, and superiority is often a mask for insecurity. To see this clearly is not to become cynical. It is to become conscious. You begin to understand that empathy is not automatic in everyone. It is a developed capacity. And when someone shows you repeatedly that they lack it, believe what is being revealed. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. Because once you stop mistaking contempt for logic and dismissal for strength, you reclaim your emotional ground. You no longer beg to be understood. You simply notice who is capable of understanding. And that awareness quietly transforms the way you relate, not only to them, but to yourself. There is a form of aggression that does not raise its voice. It does not slam doors. It does not announce itself with obvious hostility. Instead, it moves quietly, almost elegantly, beneath the surface of ordinary interactions. It smiles while it wounds. It jokes while it diminishes. And when you finally react to the sting, it steps back and says, "You're too sensitive." Some people cannot afford to show their hatred openly. Their self-image depends on appearing calm, rational, even kind. So their resentment finds another path. It becomes subtle. It becomes indirect. Instead of shouting, they provoke. Instead of attacking directly, they undermine quietly. A sarcastic comment here, a backhanded compliment there, a public joke that places you at the center of ridicule while everyone else laughs. At first, it is confusing. You sense something is wrong, but nothing is explicit enough to confront. If you object, you risk looking dramatic. If you stay silent, you feel complicit in your own diminishment. This is how concealed aggression works. It thrives in ambiguity. Then comes the final move. When you eventually gather the courage to speak up, when you say, or, "I didn't appreciate that," the response is swift and dismissive. "You're too sensitive." In that moment, the dynamic completes itself. They provoke, you react. They shame you for reacting. This creates a psychological trap with only two visible exits, both painful. You either stay silent and accept the mistreatment, slowly eroding your self-respect, or you defend yourself and get labeled unstable, dramatic, difficult. The aggressor remains composed. You become the problem. In many workplace bullying cases, victims describe this exact pattern. It rarely begins with overt hostility. It starts with small, almost trivial acts. A colleague repeatedly interrupts you in meetings. Another consistently forgets to include you in important emails. A supervisor makes subtle jokes about your competence in front of others. When you address it privately, you are told you are overthinking, overreacting, too emotional. The repetition is what causes the fracture. Each small incident on its own seems insignificant, but together they form a pattern of erosion. Like water against stone, the constant undermining wears away at confidence. You begin to anticipate the next jab. You rehearse conversations in your mind before they happen. You question your tone, your timing, your very perception. They didn't mean it. Maybe I'm reading into it. I shouldn't take it personally. This inner negotiation becomes exhausting, and that exhaustion is part of the strategy. Concealed aggression depends on your self-doubt. If you fully trusted your instincts, the pattern would be obvious. But when every reaction is met with, "You're too sensitive," your internal compass begins to spin. What makes this dynamic especially dangerous is its plausible deniability. The aggressor can always retreat behind humor or misunderstanding. "I was just joking. You took it the wrong way. I didn't mean anything by it." Their innocence is carefully curated. Meanwhile, you are left carrying the emotional residue. Over time, something subtle begins to shift inside you. You may become quieter. You may contribute less. You may shrink your personality to avoid becoming a target. Or you may grow anxious and hypervigilant, constantly scanning for the next hidden attack. In either case, your authentic self starts to recede. This is not weakness. It is the natural response to chronic psychological threat. The human psyche is wired for social belonging. When belonging is threatened through subtle humiliation, the nervous system reacts as if survival is at stake. That is why the pain feels disproportionate to the small comments. Because at a deeper level, they are not small. They are signals of rejection and hostility. And hostility, when repeated, is rarely accidental. There is often envy beneath concealed aggression, or insecurity, or resentment that cannot be openly acknowledged. Rather than confront these feelings, the aggressor projects them outward. They chip away at you to stabilize themselves. They diminish you to feel larger. And because they cannot admit this even to themselves, they must maintain the illusion that nothing harmful is happening. The most devastating part is when you begin to internalize their narrative. When you start believing you are, in fact, too sensitive. When you apologize for normal emotional reactions. When you adjust your standards downward just to keep the peace. This is how confidence fractures, not through one dramatic event, but through 1,000 subtle cuts. But awareness changes the structure of the trap. The moment you recognize the pattern, you step outside of it mentally. You see the provocation for what it is. You understand that your reaction is not instability, it is information. You begin to observe instead of absorb, and when you stop absorbing concealed aggression as truth, its power weakens. The comments may continue, but they no longer define your reality. You realize that subtle cruelty is still cruelty, even when wrapped in a smile. And you begin quietly to reclaim the space you once surrendered. To admit wrongdoing requires something rare and powerful: humility. It requires the strength to look inward and say, "I was wrong. I caused harm. I misjudged." For a grounded and self-aware person, this is uncomfortable but possible. For others, however, accountability feels like annihilation. It feels like ego death. And when the ego feels threatened, it does not surrender gracefully. It defends itself. This is where the phrase appears again, calm and almost effortless. "You're too sensitive." On the surface, it sounds casual, reasonable, even soothing. But beneath that composed tone lies a psychological defense. Instead of tolerating guilt, they redirect it. Instead of facing their cruelty, they project fragility onto you. It feels safer for them to believe you are weak than to admit they were unkind. Because if they admit wrongdoing, their internal image of themselves cracks. And for certain personalities, that crack feels unbearable. Notice how the phrase is often delivered. There is no confusion in their eyes, no curiosity, no genuine attempt to understand. Sometimes there is even a faint smile, a trace of condescension. They speak as though they are helping you gain perspective, as though they are the stable one in the room. But what is truly happening is self-protection. The ego, when fragile, will sacrifice connection to preserve its illusion of superiority. Consider the story of a man whose older brother constantly belittled his career choices. Every family gathering became an opportunity for subtle ridicule. "Still doing that little project," he would say with a smirk. When confronted, when the younger brother finally admitted that the comments felt degrading, the response was predictable. "Relax, you're too sensitive. I'm just joking." Years later, the truth surfaced quietly. The older brother had felt threatened. The younger one's risks, creativity, and eventual success confronted his own stagnation. Rather than face his insecurity, He disguised it as humor. The mockery was not playful. It was defensive. It was an unconscious attempt to shrink what made him feel small. And this is often the hidden engine behind dismissal. Insecurity that has never been examined becomes aggression that is never acknowledged. When someone says, "You're too sensitive," in response to your pain, they may be protecting a fragile self-concept. To admit they hurt you would mean admitting they are capable of harm. To apologize would require stepping down from a position of imagined superiority. For some, that dissent feels intolerable, so they invert the situation. They maintain calm. They position themselves as rational. You become emotional. They become steady. You become unstable. The narrative protects them at your expense. This dynamic can be deeply confusing because the aggressor does not appear overtly hostile. They may even seem composed and logical, but composure does not equal innocence. Sometimes composure is simply well-controlled defensiveness. When accountability feels like ego death, projection becomes the escape route. They cannot hold the image of themselves as cruel, so they construct an image of you as fragile. It is a psychological trade. They preserve their pride. You carry the doubt. Over time, if this pattern continues, you may begin adjusting yourself to protect their ego. You soften your reactions. You hesitate before expressing discomfort. You downplay your needs so they will not feel attacked. And without realizing it, you start managing their insecurity instead of honoring your own boundaries. This is how emotional imbalance forms in relationships. One person bends to maintain harmony. The other remains rigid to preserve self-image. The more you bend, the less they are required to grow. But there is a deeper truth here that must be faced with courage. Insecurity, when unexamined, does not remain passive. It seeks relief, and relief often comes through control, ridicule, or subtle dominance. What begins as discomfort inside them can become intentional harm toward you. Not always consciously, not always maliciously planned, but repeatedly, predictably, and painfully. When you recognize this, something shifts. You begin to see that their dismissal is not a verdict on your sensitivity. It is a window into their fragility. Their refusal to apologize is not proof that you are dramatic. It is evidence that they cannot tolerate vulnerability within themselves. This awareness does not require bitterness. It requires clarity. You understand that empathy requires strength. Humility requires security. And when someone consistently chooses ego over connection, it tells you something profound about their internal world. The next time the phrase is delivered with that calm, controlled tone, you may notice the underlying fear. The fear of being wrong, the fear of being exposed, the fear of being less than perfect. And instead of collapsing into self-doubt, you observe. Because once you understand that their ego is being protected at your expense, you stop volunteering as the shield. You stop absorbing blame that does not belong to you. You begin to stand quietly in your own perception. And in that quiet stance, their defense loses its grip. Everyone can fail once. In a moment of stress, pride, or defensiveness, any of us might dismiss someone's feelings too quickly. A single careless response does not define a person. Human beings are imperfect, and relationships require room for error. But repetition changes the meaning of behavior. Repetition transforms accident into pattern, and patterns reveal intention. When the phrase, "you're too sensitive," appears once, it may be immaturity. When it appears twice, it may be defensiveness. But when it appears again and again, especially after you have clearly communicated your hurt, you are no longer standing in misunderstanding. You are standing in disregard. Disregard is quieter than hatred, but often more dangerous. Hatred announces itself. Disregard erodes you slowly. Consider what repetition truly means. You express that a certain comment wounds you. You explain calmly. You choose your words carefully. The other person nods, perhaps even pretends to understand. Yet weeks later, the same comment returns, the same tone, the same dismissal. And again, when you react, the familiar verdict arrives. You're too sensitive. At that moment, something becomes unmistakable. They know it hurts you. They have been informed. They have seen your reaction. And still, they continue. When someone knows a behavior causes pain and repeats it anyway, the pain becomes purposeful. Even if they never say, "I intend to hurt you," their actions communicate it clearly. Intent is not only declared through words, it is demonstrated through persistence. This is why repetition is so revealing. It strips away excuses. It removes the comfort of ambiguity. The first time, you may question yourself. The second time, you may rationalize. The third or fourth time, clarity begins to emerge. Not because you are becoming cynical, but because reality is repeating itself. Intentional damage often hides behind repetition because repetition normalizes harm. It conditions you to accept what once shocked you. Slowly, your standards adjust downward. What once felt unacceptable becomes just how they are. And in adapting to survive the dynamic, you begin abandoning parts of yourself. You might start minimizing your reactions. You might rehearse sentences in your mind before speaking, trying to make them softer, smaller, less threatening. You may attempt to prove that you are not sensitive, not dramatic, not difficult. But this effort is exhausting, and it is misplaced. This is the moment awareness must awaken. Instead of trying to prove your resilience, you shift your attention to the pattern itself. You stop debating whether your feelings are valid. You start observing behavior objectively. How many times has this happened? How often does accountability get replaced with dismissal? How consistently are your boundaries tested? Patterns never lie. Individual incidents can be misunderstood. Patterns cannot. When you step back and view the repetition clearly, you regain psychological power. You are no longer reacting blindly to each isolated event. You are recognizing a structure. And once you see the structure, you can make informed decisions about how to protect yourself. This awareness does not require confrontation in every case. Sometimes it requires distance. Sometimes it requires firmer boundaries. Sometimes it requires accepting that the person in front of you is unwilling to change. Not incapable, unwilling. There is a profound difference. When you stop trying to convince someone that you are not sensitive, you reclaim energy. You no longer over-explain your emotions in hopes of being validated. You do not argue endlessly about tone or intention. You simply notice consistency. You let behavior speak for itself. And something subtle but powerful shifts inside you. The anxiety begins to fade. The confusion lessens, because confusion thrives in inconsistency, but clarity thrives in repetition. Once you accept what is consistently shown to you, the internal struggle quiets. You realize that your emotional responses were never the core issue. The real issue was the refusal to respect them. You understand that sensitivity to disrespect is not weakness. It is self-awareness. It is the psyche signaling that something is misaligned. When someone repeatedly dismisses that signal, it is not your responsibility to silence it. It is your responsibility to listen. There is strength in recognizing patterns without dramatizing them. There is maturity in observing without immediate reaction. And there is dignity in quietly deciding what you will and will not tolerate. Repetition removes illusion. It clarifies character. It reveals values. And once you see it clearly, you no longer need endless debate. You no longer need their agreement to validate your perception. You simply trust what has been consistently demonstrated. And in that trust, you step out of the cycle of doubt and into the steadiness of awareness. The most dangerous hostility is not loud. It is subtle. It is composed. It sounds reasonable. You're too sensitive. But you must ask yourself, sensitive to what? Disrespect, mockery, manipulation. Sensitivity to injustice is not weakness. It is intelligence. Your emotions are signals. They are data. They are internal alarms. And when someone repeatedly invalidates those alarms, it may not be because you are fragile. It may be because they know exactly what they are doing. The moment you recognize this, something shifts. You stop shrinking. You stop defending your feelings. You start protecting your boundaries. And that is when the dynamic changes. Because the person who can no longer manipulate your perception can no longer control you.